Gentrification. You probably have come across this word before, but might have not fully understood what it meant. No worries, I felt the same way a few years ago. I first encountered gentrification in the summer of 2017, when I had an internship in New York City. I had a few days to spare before my job started, so I decided to explore New York a little bit more. My friends suggested I should go to a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Williamsburg. When I Googled how to get there, a lot of articles popped up talking about how the neighborhood has gentrified and completely changed over the years. And at that point, I realized I didn't know what gentrification meant, and I didn't know what a gentrified neighborhood looked like. So I hopped on a train and went over to see for myself. And once I got to Williamsburg, I was quite surprised to find 3 parts of the neighborhood that looked quite distinct from each other. The first one is in the most southern part of Williamsburg, which is the home of a Hasidic Orthodox Jewish community. Hasidic Jews are known for their black traditional attire, distinct hats, and long beards. And the first thing I noticed was that many of the signs, posters, and even the school buses were in Hebrew, and that most of the people walking around were Hasidic Jewish. It was quite the opposite what I expected to see in a gentrified neighborhood. Once I continued my journey towards the north, the neighborhood suddenly changed. People were sitting in the streets, playing domino, and I could hear people speaking Spanish to each other. I later learned that the middle part of Williamsburg is the home of a Latino community. It was a bit different to the Hasidic part, since it was much more of a mix of people, which made me think I was getting closer to the gentrified part. Once I arrived in the most northern part of Williamsburg, the neighborhood changed again. People were standing in front of mirrors and graffitis, taking pictures for Instagram. Others were sitting at fancy cafes, drinking $5 lattes, while others were shopping at Apple, H&M, or hipster second-hand stores. And I was quite intrigued how all 3 parts of the neighborhood looked quite distinct from each other. And I was really interested how and where gentrification starts and how it unfolds. But before we get there, let me first define gentrification. The etymology of the word consists of 2 parts. The first part comes from the English word gentry, denoting people of wealth and status, so basically the upper class. The second part of the word comes from the Latin word fication, meaning causing or changing something. While there's a general agreement where the 2 parts of the word come from, there's more disagreement what it actually means. However, a quite encompassing definition I consider is that gentrification is a process of repairing and rebuilding homes and businesses in a deteriorating urban neighborhood, accompanied by an influx of middle-class and affluent people that often displaces long-term residents that are usually poor. In other words, gentrification is a process by which new businesses, like a Starbucks or a mall, move into a poor neighborhood, which often attracts wealthy people to follow suit, and it often increases the living and rent cost, which often then forces long-term residents to have to move away because they can't afford to live there anymore. There are 2 things I want to point out. For some people, the benefits of creating new economic opportunities and jobs outweigh the costs, and therefore they see gentrification as an inherently positive process. While for others, the cost of displacing long-term residents from their homes outweigh the benefits, and therefore they see it as an inherently negative process. So after having a better theoretical understanding of gentrification, I decided to move to Williamsburg for 7 months to study the impact of gentrification for long-term residents as part of my senior thesis. I was particularly interested in the impact it had on the Latino community. Since over the past 10 years, they have lost over 30% of their community members. Williamsburg was historically known to be an economic powerhouse in New York City. Companies had warehouses and factories in the north part of the neighborhood, which allowed them to produce and store their products and easily ship them via the East River. In the 1960s, there were over 90,000 manufacturing jobs available in Williamsburg alone, which was also one of the main reasons why so many Latinos decided to move from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and other Latin American countries to the neighborhood. However, over time, many of these jobs got outsourced to developing countries or became automated, which led that by the 1990s, there were only 10,000 jobs left, and even fewer today. And this result has left behind a lot of poverty, but also a lot of unutilized industrial spaces behind. Here, you can see a picture of a doll factory from that time. And here is a picture of the same doll factory today. The gentrification of the north part of Williamsburg started when artists started to move in the 80s and 90s, renovated these former industrial spaces and made them their homes. And artists are often considered the first wave of gentrifiers, since they often produce new cultural amenities, like art exhibitions and concerts that attract wealthier residents to these neighborhoods to enjoy these new amenities, and also businesses who want to capitalize on a new existing wealthier population. And I actually lived in this building. My roommate decided to renovate part of the factory and make it his home. Here, you can see a picture of our living room, where we would spend evenings together, have brunch on Sunday, and host people over for dinner parties. And throughout my time there, I decided to talk to people who recently moved to the neighborhood, who would be considered gentrifiers, about their view of the process. And the most common response I received is that neighborhoods always change and never stay the same. And this is the argument often used by proponents of gentrification. We see there's a natural process how cities and neighborhoods can reinvent themselves. Here, you can see a picture of the Williamsburg waterfront in 2003, with a lot of unutilized industrial space. And next to it is a picture of the same waterfront 10 years later. So you can see how the gentrification brought in new investments for new apartments to be built, which allowed more people to make the neighborhood their home. And I could understand the argument that neighborhoods always change, since I lived in a former factory. And also I could see that gentrification had positive outcomes on the neighborhood, since it's created a new economic outlook and jobs to a neighborhood that was suffering from industrial decline in the past. However, I also wanted to understand the other side of the argument. People who've been residing in the neighborhood for multiple generations and what their view was of the process. Through the support of some local nonprofits, I was able to get in touch with Latino residents who were willing to speak to me and share with me their experience. And the most common concern they had was that they felt their community was carrying much of the cost of the gentrification. The increased living cost and rent cost forced many of their family members and friends to have to move away because they couldn't afford anymore to live in the neighborhood. However, the more intriguing part I learned from my interviews was that for many, it also felt that gentrification was causing their culture and their way of life to be displaced. For instance, one of my interviewees who grew up in Williamsburg told me that there was a neighborhood tradition to open up fire hydrants in the summer and to sprinkle water on the streets, to let children play and cool down in the summer heat. However, with the arrival of new people due to gentrification, some of these people started to complain to city officials regarding the water in front of their homes. This led to this community tradition occurred less and less often. Another example, which I actually experienced myself, is that for many interviews, for people living in Williamsburg, it was a community tradition to use the streets in front of their homes as social gathering places, to have block parties, and to have family and birthday celebrations, where they would barbecue in the streets and listen to loud music till late in the evening. However, with the arrival of new people due to gentrification, some of these people started to complain regarding the noise in the evening, and sometimes even called to police. This led to this tradition occurred less and less often. And I could really understand the other side of the argument, how people who've been living in these neighborhoods for many, many generations and felt that the gentrification was causing their culture and their way of life being displaced for the benefit of creating new economic opportunities. However, there was one aspect I still couldn't fully understand, that why it was so important for the Latino residents to continue living in a neighborhood that was constantly becoming more expensive and also was slowly being completely changed. And towards the end of my stay, I had the opportunity to have dinner with 3 of my informants, who shared with me home-cooked Puerto Rican and Dominican dishes. And throughout the evening, they would trace to me their history of living in Williamsburg. And when they first arrived as young immigrants in the 50s and 60s, when they first met their spouses, when they got married, and when they passed away, when they first had children, where they went to school, and when they graduated, and the many celebrations they had with their friends and neighbors over the years in the neighborhood. And I would always emphasize how all these memories were created in Williamsburg. When I asked them about the prospect of having to leave the neighborhood, they all responded that would mean leaving behind the memories and experience that made them to the person who they are today, which ultimately means they would have to leave behind an essential part of their identity. And this is the last piece of the gentrification puzzle that is often overlooked. How many families and communities have created distinct urban identities over multiple generations that are as salient as for someone else their national identity might be. And identification is causing people to be uprooted from these neighborhoods that define these identities. I want us to take a step back and use the experience of these ladies to think about our own lives in cities and ask why our urban experience has become such an important part of our identity. And a fact that I consider to answer part of the question is that in 2008, we have crossed the halfway mark by which half of the world population lives in urban areas. And the United Nations predict that by 2050, 64% of the emerging world and 84% of the developed world will be urbanized. This is the defining feature of the 21st century, where more and more people are moving to cities, and life in urban areas has reached a new level of permanency. With this in mind, I want to ask you to think about the places you call home, the experience and memories you have created at these places, and how these are often embedded in particular neighborhoods and cities, and how these experiences tie you to these neighborhoods and cities for a long time. With this in mind, when you next time think about and hear about gentrification, I want you to consider both sides of the argument. How first, the gentrification can have positive outcomes of creating new economic opportunities and jobs, while also considering the other side, that gentrification at times causes the displacement of local residents and their communities. However, the more important dimension I want to consider is that in an age where all our lives will occur in cities, gentrification will inhibit us to form long-lasting identifications to the places we call home. Thank you very much.